Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series presented by the Education Committee for the Southern California PGA. Catalyst webinar series is a bi-weekly educational platform for creating success and change in your club and career. We're very excited to have Mr. Bill O'Brien on the Catalyst this morning. Bill is the Senior Vice President of Operations for Troon Golf. As we all know, Troon Golf manages and operates over 400 properties worldwide. Good morning, Bill. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series.
Good morning, John. Good to be here. Thank you.
We are delighted that you're here with us this morning. It's all yours for about 35 or 40 minutes. Take us through a presentation. We're delighted. Thanks again.
Thanks, John. Well, I am pleased to be here. I wish we were in person. These kinds of presentations generally can be more effective when we can see each other and ask questions in real time. Having said that, it's my privilege to chat with you today. I'm dialing in from Irvine, California. We opened our office here in July of 2018, and I'm sitting in that building that you're looking at right on your screen. We'll have a bit of a conversation today. We're going to talk about culture. I'll give you a little bit of background as to who I am and our company. We'll talk a little bit about how leadership, accountability, and hospitality factor into creating culture. We'll talk about our approach to create effective culture in our organization. I've got a few resources that I'm interested in sharing with you, and then clearly a few minutes at the end as it relates to Q&A. So we'll get started. Culture as defined by Google is a collection of patterns, a collection of beliefs, a collection of behaviors, and they are germane to the attitudes, values, morals, and goals of an organization. I think what's interesting as it relates to culture, you certainly have one at your club. It's either effective or it's ineffective. To the extent it's effective, you probably have highly engaged employees, highly satisfied members and guests. To the extent it's an ineffective culture, perhaps you're dealing with more than your fair share of dislocation. And what I mean by dislocation is a series of recurring unfortunate events, which we tend to maybe blame on outside forces, but there's a good chance it's a byproduct of the culture you have at the club. And so the chat today is about the steps we can take to be aware of what things go into creating an effective culture. It's taken me a while to come to this place where I feel like we need to define our leadership approach. For those of you who are on the phone in a leadership role, if you haven't taken steps to define your leadership approach, to define why it is that you do what you do, I hope you get something out of this conversation where you can take a bit of that journey. Having been a mentor in our organization through our leader program, I've had to wrestle with why I do what I do. And that's the nature of growth. And I've come to a place where I feel like my job in supporting West Coast operations, over 30 properties from San Diego to Seattle, is to just create spaces where people can do their best work and where members and guests feel like the best versions of themselves. And this is kind of where I've boiled 30 years of work into, and it's taken a while to get there. I'm sure I know some of you on the call today. I'm from Phoenix originally, born and raised. My first job was on a county course on the far west side of Phoenix. Played junior golf and come to really appreciate all the things we do in the golf business. After college, I spent some time at the Arizona Biltmore Country Club in Central Phoenix. Like many of us probably on the phone, started in a bag room. And in '98, I got a chance to join the company I work for now at Troon North Golf Club in Scottsdale. I was a first assistant there, and then headed to Savannah, Georgia, where we opened a semi-private club as the head golf professional. Came back to the West Coast, where I worked John in Rancho Mirage at the Westin Mission Hills Resort and Spa as a director of golf. And then made my way to San Diego, where I was the GM at Maderas for nearly 9 years. And really enjoyed every opportunity that club brought. And admittedly, have had some successes and some losses through this journey in creating my own effective cultures. And feel privileged to be able to talk a little bit about some of those wins and some of those losses with you today. I moved into the corporate office in 2014, celebrating 6 years this week, actually. I work closely with 19 clubs in terms of my personal portfolio, and then support about 30 clubs along the West Coast. I'm going to try to get a little fancy here with some technology, so let's hope this works. This is Simon Sinek, wrote the book Start With Why. This is a 5-minute video. I think there's some compelling insights that I'd like you to ponder shortly.
I call it the golden circle. Why, how, what? This little idea explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to inspire where others aren't. Let me define the terms really quickly. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do, 100%. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your proprietary process or your USP. But very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. And by why, I don't mean to make a profit. That's a result. It's always a result. By why, I mean what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why does your organization exist? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? And why should anyone care? Well, as a result, the way we think, the way we act, the way we communicate is from the outside in. It's obvious. We go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. But the inspired leaders and the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. I use Apple because it's easy to understand and everybody gets it. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. And that's how most of us communicate. That's how most marketing is done. That's how most sales is done. And that's how most of us communicate interpersonally. We say what we do. We say how we're different or how we're better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's our new law firm. We have the best lawyers with the biggest clients. We have, we always perform for our clients, do business with us. Here's our new car. It gets great gas mileage. It has, leather seats. Buy our car. But it's uninspiring. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Totally different, right? You're ready to buy a computer from them. All I did was reverse the order of the information. What it proves to us is that people don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. This explains why every single person in this room is perfectly comfortable buying a computer from Apple. But we're also perfectly comfortable buying an MP3 player from Apple, or a phone from Apple, or a DVR from Apple. But as I said before, Apple's just a computer company. There's nothing that distinguishes them structurally from any of their competitors. Their competitors are all equally qualified to make all of these products. In fact, they tried. A few years ago, Gateway came out with flat screen TVs. They're eminently qualified to make flat screen TVs. They've been making flat screen monitors for years. Nobody bought one. And Dell came out with MP3 players and PDAs. And they make great quality products, and they can make perfectly well-designed products. And nobody bought one. In fact, talking about it now, we can't even imagine buying an MP3 player from Dell. Why would you buy an MP3 player from a computer company? But we do it every day. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. When we communicate from the outside in, yes, people can understand vast amounts of complicated information like features and benefits and facts and figures. It just doesn't drive behavior. When we communicate from the inside out, we're talking directly to the part of the brain that controls behavior, and then we allow people to rationalize it with the tangible things we say and do. This is where gut decisions come from. You know, sometimes you can give somebody all the facts and the figures, and they say, I know what all the facts and details say, but it just doesn't feel right. Why would we use that verb? It doesn't feel right. Because the part of the brain that controls decision-making doesn't control language. And the best we can muster up is, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Or sometimes you say you're leading with your heart, or you're leading with your soul. Well, I hate to break it to you, those aren't other body parts controlling your behavior. It's all happening here in your limbic brain, the part of the brain that controls decision-making and not language. But if you don't know why you do what you do, and people respond to why you do what you do, then how will you ever get people to vote for you or buy something from you, or more importantly, be loyal?
So I think what resonated with me there is the journey we need to take in order to determine why it is we do what we do. Because our guests, our members, maybe most importantly our employees, don't buy what we do, they buy why we do it. And so going through this process to understand exactly what it is that you do and why you go about it really starts the process of evaluating the culture at your club. Shifting gears for a moment, our company and our approach to culture has really three pillars: hospitality, accountability, and leadership. And to the extent you haven't defined the pillars of your organization, I would encourage you to take a bit of that approach. And this org chart shows what we see typically at each club. Clearly, our company supports department managers to supports a GM, and that's how we're designed. If you work in a self-managed environment or not affiliated with a management company, the question I have is, to what extent have we given your teammates a support network? And not just those who are at your club per se, but those outside the club. And are there resources, outlets, mentors that your teammates can turn to outside of the most senior leader at the club? And by doing so, there's a concept that happens or occurs, and we refer to it as working on your business instead of always working just in your business. And if we don't take this more macro approach to running our clubs, running our courses, we can stay in a really hectic space. And if we stay in that hectic space, we know teams ultimately will peter out to some extent, and that culture will show that. Training is probably the single most important aspect of sustaining a quality culture. It certainly isn't what creates the culture, but it is part of sustaining a culture. And over the years where I've landed on this, members and guests, owners really focus on two things. service predictability, and financial predictability. And again, there are certainly other things that get discussed, but time and time again, in owner meetings, in boardrooms, with teams, the two things the people we serve want most is service predictability and financial predictability. And the most effective way to give our stakeholders that is by institutionalizing a culture of training. And we generally see that training is probably only as good as the GM. And if the GM isn't passionate about training, neither is the team. But if the GM or the director of golf is passionate about training, we generally see clubs and operations that run without dislocation. The types of training you're going to want to consider as you build out your approach certainly are behavior-based training, helping people understand the nuance of reducing frustration or making people feel a certain way through an experience. So behavior-based training and curriculum should be part of your approach. Skills-based training, we tend to leave it up to maybe other people on the team to conduct skills-based training when the most senior managers are probably the most adept at doing that training. And so I would ask, who's doing the training at your club and what effect is that having on your culture? And then compliance-based training. We all need to know how to react in an environment where there's harassment. And so I would pose this question to those on the phone: what approach to training do you currently have, and how involved are you in applying that training on a daily basis? If we were standing in front of one another, I'd ask the group if anybody knew what this stood for. Well, to me, this acronym is the single most effective way to make sure your training program works. And it's called Management by Walking Around. And it sounds innocent enough, but although it's simple, it doesn't happen nearly enough in the clubs where culture is suffering. Our teams are thirsty for our leadership. Our members and guests are thirsty for our visibility and approachability. And so if you're not doing a fair amount of management by walking around on a daily basis, and by fair amount we see in the healthiest cultures, it's probably 40 to 50% of your day. You're in the places where employees gather, you're in the places where members and guests play, you're applying your training curriculum, that skills-based, behavior-based, that compliance-based training, by being in those spaces. So our company's taken a bit of approach to make sure, as we evaluate culture, that we have considered all of the influences on culture. And after being around for 30 years, we've kind of come down to plus or minus 8 different pillars, if you will. And I'll go through each of these briefly. And they touch every aspect of leadership life. They touch every aspect of employee life, member life, guest life, and owner life. And our summary here is, to the extent you've considered each of these opportunities, it's highly likely you're going to have a good culture. So that's what this is intended to help shape for the next part of this discussion. Governance. I've seen more effective leaders get tripped up over unhealthy organizational clarity. I've seen more teams get tripped up because they don't have visibility to who the stakeholders are. Some clubs tend to experience more than their fair share of dislocation because there is no business plan in place. and none of the teammates, none of the stakeholders are aware of it. And so the idea here is that in order to affect a positive culture, all the stakeholders on the team need to understand what it is that we're doing over the long haul. Is there a strategic plan in place? In the absence of a strategic plan, it's very hard to align people's efforts. If you don't have a business plan, which is kind of the 12-month version of a strategic plan, and that it lives and breathes, it's really tough to align the goals and objectives of each of the departments you have at your club. Many of us are going through the budget process right now, and perhaps you're working on a business plan, but in many cases, admittedly, even in my own experience, it stayed on a shelf. Instead of using it as a tool to communicate on a frequent basis. And when we use a business plan to communicate to our stakeholders, and that includes our employees and our owners, our members, and our guests, generally people have a really clear idea of what it is that we're doing. You've already established why it is that we're doing it, and it tends to result in a higher performing team. You heard Simon Sinek ask the question, what is your why? And there's a personal why that affects your leadership approach, and then there's an out-facing why, which affects the brand at your club. For those of you who've been into Oceanside, you know, Goat Hill reimagined its brand in the last 5 or so years. And what I thought was interesting, I took this picture a couple of years ago when I was there, you know, world class, working class. They have a really clear sense of who they are. And in too many cases, we tend to sell 18 holes of championship golf, but we don't really sell a why. And so wrestling with a competitive advantage helps give your team that kind of clarity it needs, helps give the leaders at the club the kind of clarity it needs to make relevant decisions. So if you haven't come up with a why for your club the same way Goat Hill has, I would challenge you to consider going through that exercise. Certainly not easy. But then the trick is, once you've landed on your why, is just to remind your members, remind your employees, remind your guests, you know, what that why is. Keep reminding them they made the right decision. And generally, when people all feel kind of as though their why is aligned, an effective culture really starts to take shape. And in doing so, results in, you know, some pretty high levels of membership and guest satisfaction. And this is where probably the most amount of dislocation can occur, is when we have unsatisfied members or unsatisfied guests. And so to what extent are you taking steps to really build your culture? Again, we talked a little bit about training being the best way to sustain it. What are the tools that you're using, that your team needs in order to effectively deliver that kind of service predictability? If we were standing in front of one another, I'd ask to see a show of hands. How many people have quality standards at their club? And if you don't, you probably haven't defined what good looks like for your team. Some may argue that this range picture here on the right looks fine. Some might argue that it looks terrible. But if there's no definition of good, and it doesn't live and breathe in your training, fully expect people to be confused. Surveys are an effective way to help improve the culture at a club by giving us some real insights into what employees think and or members and guests think about the operation. If you're not doing regular surveys, there's a good chance you might be missing the point in terms of what members and guests are looking for. We found too that applying best practices can be an effective way for our guests and our members to be happy, which ultimately means our employees are satisfied. Name recognition is an effective best practice that often is overlooked. There are too many people who come to our clubs to eat, to play, and we don't they are, and that includes those of us at private clubs. It's a often overlooked yet simple way to improve the overall experience at a club, which just again is a statement of that club's culture. Are you focused in your club's culture on, retaining and developing the best associates? I know a lot of us say that we are, but when we dig into it, really, what steps have you taken to have a plan to retain and develop associates? If there isn't a curriculum, if there isn't a training program that has a curriculum that lives and breathes on a monthly basis, even a weekly basis, there's a missed opportunity. The department meetings we've all sat in for years where we circle the table and give updates is certainly one way to have a department meeting. I've seen the healthiest clubs with the best culture talk about what it is that they're focused on for that particular week. It might be name recognition, it might be a faster pace of play, it might be more covers in the grill, but there's a curriculum generally that outlines their training program that makes employees feel like they're well equipped and well armed to deal with their day and their job. Onboarding is probably most overlooked. Do you have classroom time with new hires? Do you have quizzes for new hires? Do they understand exactly what it is that you expect of them in those first few days? Or are you leaving it up to maybe an hourly employee, although seniored or tenured, to conduct that, and perhaps you're not quite as involved? Again, the onboarding program is a highly effective way to build the right culture in your facility. If you've worked at a hotel property, you've definitely attended a daily lineup. It's kind of the huddle before the day starts. And if you're not doing a daily lineup, you're missing a neat opportunity to kind of cover that curriculum, cover that quality standard, cover that opportunity to really wow somebody's day. And I would encourage you to figure out how and when to make that occur. It's a 10-minute meeting. And those of you who are doing them, I probably suspect you're getting a lot of value out of those. But bottom line, employees are thirsty for leadership. They want to do a good job. Let's give them the tools, resources, and kind of the daily reminders that they're on the right path. And when that occurs, the healthiest clubs are benefiting from that. Is your culture focused on sales? And if you're in a for-profit environment, pretty good chance that it is. If you're in a nonprofit environment, you might not take quite the same approach. But in today's industry, the single most effective way to affect your economics is to make sure there's a culture of sales. And that's at a daily fee, resort, municipal, or private club operation. And a culture of sales has a lot of aspects to it. There's clearly the outreach aspect, there's clearly the retention aspect. I think the most healthiest clubs have a specific meeting each week devoted to what's happening in terms of sales at our club, what's happening in terms of retention at our club. And it's devoted to understanding your pace relative to plan, maybe same time last year. But if you aren't devoting the right amount of time and attention to the sales objectives of your operation, your economics are going to suffer. And when your economics suffer, dislocation ensues. And when that occurs, your culture becomes at risk. So that's a long way of saying that the healthiest clubs are focused on sales and in a very process-oriented way. Healthy clubs with effective cultures are focused on hitting the numbers. Again, this is, number 6 of 8 ideas to evaluate in terms of their effect on your culture. If you're missing the number, there's generally a lot of panic, a lot of desperation. It trickles out into the workforce. Guests and members feel it, and there is a less healthy culture than if you are hitting the numbers. That permeates through the club. Stakeholders are happy, and people can do their best work. And to what extent you're using tools to help you hit the numbers, that certainly ensures that kind of financial predictability that you're looking for. In my years of doing this, I'm still a little surprised that more GMs and or directors don't sign purchase orders, don't review a checkbook, and oftentimes are surprised by their results at month end. And so that predictability is only there if you clearly understand the inputs and the outputs that affect your bottom line. And purchase order approvals, checkbook usage, scheduling labor using dollars instead of hours helps give you that kind of predictability. And again, clubs that are hitting their number tend to be healthier. The culture tends to be more effective. There tends to be a little less panic. None of the healthy clubs get to be where they are without the right leadership. I took this picture outside of Detroit. I think it was probably November or December last year. I work with a club there, and there's a little restaurant nearby where I go, and this is the sign there. And the reason I like this sign is because it defines a value. It defines a why. And to the extent you have defined the traits that you're most passionate about, it's highly likely you can recruit the employees that you need to join your team. Recruiting and hiring is not the same. We've all solicited resumes and picked out the best from the stack of resumes, and maybe that hire didn't work out. Versus defining the why first, defining the values first, and defining the traits that we seek to hire for. In our organization, we kind of expect people to have direct experience. We expect people to work hard. We value kindness. We value work ethic. We value problem solving. We value enthusiasm. We value curiosity. And so to the extent you've gone through the exercise of trying to figure out what are the traits that you're most passionate about, it turns a hiring process into a recruiting process. And so I would encourage us, if we're not taking steps to define those traits, to define those values, and we still yet want a healthy culture, that's a change probably that needs to be made. Performance evaluations go a long way in making sure the right leadership stays. Good employees want to hear how they're doing. They really do. And if there isn't a review process kind of institutionalized in your club to help them understand what track they're on, they may be at risk at leaving. And the clubs with the least effective culture are constantly backfilling open positions. And so there's a lot to unpack in finding the right leaders for your club, but as you think about your culture and you evaluate your culture, I would encourage you to look at whether or not your team is made up of the right people. And then lastly, effective culture oftentimes can be boiled down to whether or not your club is relevant, and or whether your team is relevant. And by relevant, I mean, are you keeping up with the pace of change? And if you haven't adopted technology tools to have people book tea times online. If you haven't adopted a app that starters and hostesses can see the faces of the people who are pulling into their club, there's a good chance that you're not going to be as plugged into who's coming into your property, whereby your neighbor club who has adopted some of these tools is. And so they're going to be more relevant, which means they're going to be more attractive, which means the best employees are going to want to work there. And so the idea here in looking at capital, the idea here at looking at whether or not you're outpacing change is to evaluate whether or not you've created an environment for your members and employees to feel like the best versions of themselves. We all have a personal brand. Nobody's interested in working at a broken product. And so you have to ask yourself, am I able to attract the kind of people I want to attract if I'm not able to affect the quality of my product? So in summary, culture exists at your club. It's either good or it's bad, it's effective or it's ineffective. And if you feel as though it's struggling, the intent here is to look at these 8 key areas to help you decide the best way to give yourself a bit of a baseline and then decide which of these best practices maybe are effective for you to deploy at your club. There's a few good resources I would encourage anybody to check out. Start with Why. The brief video you saw earlier is a super book written by Simon Sinek. We've built it into our training culture at Troon. It's part of our leadership curriculum. Understanding your why, understanding your club's why is essential into creating the right kind of culture. Seth Godin's a bit of a marketing maverick. He does a nice job in explaining why people make the decisions they make. And I found it personally and professionally quite useful. Another good podcast out there these days is Freakonomics. Again, does a good job of helping us understand why people make the decisions they make. And as our business continues to get competitive, we're kind of in this space to attract the best talent. And so understanding why people make those decisions is really useful from my perspective. And then lastly, I just read a book by John Doerr. He was a organizational leader in Google, an organizational leader in Intel, and he's come up with what he describes as a pretty simple approach to getting some alignment in terms of goal setting at your clubs, which tends to be in a really effective way to sustain good culture. They're called OKRs, objectives and key results, and it's a simple way to rally your team around action items and tasks. So a couple of good resources I think that the group might be interested in. That concludes my presentation for today. I wish we could have met face to face. If there are any questions, John, I'm happy to answer those.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Bill.
Were there any questions, John? I know that Eric shared a couple, but I'm happy to take those. If not, let me know what's next.
Yeah, we do have questions. What are the first few things you would recommend a club to do to identify their culture and how to improve it?
I would do an employee survey, and I would do a member or guest survey. And you know, there are sample surveys out there. I'm happy to share surveys that we use, but let's hear what people have to say about the tools they have, the communication that's used, the clarity around goals and objectives that they do or don't have. But those survey results go a long way in really giving us a baseline in terms of, you know, our members and employees willing to recommend this club to a friend or family member. That's called the Net Promoter Score. If the Net Promoter Score is low, we have a problem.
The Net Promoter Score. Can you share a little more on that?
For sure. There's a great book out there called The Ultimate Question, and it's written by Fred Reichheld. And the Net Promoter Score is simply the difference between those at your club who are willing to promote it and those at your club who are detractors. So if you were to ask one single question of employees or members, how willing are you to recommend your club to a friend or family member? And on a scale of 1 to 10, those who are promoters answer with a 9 or a 10. Those who are detractors answer between 0 and 6. Passive people in the middle are 7 and 8s. You take the number of promoters, subtract the number of detractors, and you have the Net Promoter Score. If we were at a hotel, typically a decent Net Promoter Score is around 60 or 65. At a private club, a decent Net Promoter Score is generally north of 50. And at a high-end daily fee property, a good Net Promoter Score could be above 80. So, and employees get asked the same question, John. How willing are you to recommend your club as a place of employment? And if they're not willing to recommend their club as a place of employment to a friend or family member, we have an issue.
Fantastic. In your experience, have you witnessed a facility or two that has poor culture, and how did that affect their reputation, retention, and profitability?
Yeah, they struggle in that regard. I have. And generally it comes down to not having the right team, and not defining the traits that are important to that club in terms of their recruiting process. And what ultimately happens is when you have the wrong team, you have a lot of service unpredictability. So in a private environment, maybe the food comes out, different from the kitchen every other day. Or perhaps my name's not getting used. In a daily fee environment, pace of play perhaps is an issue, and there's a constant struggle with turnover in the bag room, resulting in issues out on the golf course that require a lot of supervision. And so if we're not hiring the right people who share the same values, it can dramatically affect the reputation of a club in a bad way.
On the flip side of that, have you seen a club, I'm sure you have, with a very positive culture, and what are the positive effects of that, and how specific can you be?
For sure. I mean, we've all been to those places where you can sense at arrival that people are on it. And again, that generally comes down to a leadership team that manages by walking around. And when there's plenty of management by walking around, employees feel seen, members feel heard, and we're there to prevent issues before they happen. We're there to celebrate successes as they happen. And that comes down to being out of our office. And so positive cultures have GMs, senior leaders, who are constantly in the spaces where members play and employees work. I can think of, Marty Hefkin's a colleague of mine who's now up at Pine Canyon. He's never in his office. His mission in life is not to answer emails. His mission in life is to create great experiences for his employees and his members. And as a result, Pine Canyon's a top 100 club now. But he's constantly out, constantly.
What are a few good steps in creating positive culture at a brand new facility?
Well, onboarding is important, especially at a brand new facility. We work with a club at Park City, Utah called Red Ledges, and they have a training program called Red Ledges Discovery. And the first 2 days of that training program are all classroom. And it includes ownership. It includes all senior leadership. Senior leadership and ownership actually conduct the training. And so by building an onboarding program that clearly identifies, a club's why, their values, and their traits, you're setting people up for a lot of success, which also means you can hold them to a higher level of accountability. And so that 2-day in-class onboarding solution has made that a pretty remarkable project. And it's essential in a new build because you're defining for customers and members who haven't yet joined that facility or played golf there who you are. And if you don't take the steps to define that, you're probably going to be at risk.
And final question, how important is transparency, honesty, and communication in regards to creating a winning culture?
Oh, I think the answer there is pretty self-evident. Honest discussions about performance often are overlooked because it gets a little confrontational. I think most people generally want to do a good job. Most people are thirsty for some real critical feedback on how to do a good job, but because it doesn't happen in some sort of cadence, it can oftentimes come off as feeling, overly critical. But if we don't have real-time, honest feedback as it relates to performance, I don't know that our teams get better. If there are instructors on the phone, we know that in a lesson we're providing that kind of feedback. It's what that student needs in order to get better, and it happens in real time. You're literally and figuratively, there, hands-on. And so, if you can have honest, transparent, and critical discussions with your team in real time, it's highly likely that they're going to benefit from that. Clearly, effective communication generally results in a good culture. I think defining effective communication is important. There are too many clubs that don't have a daily lineup. That's one tool for effective communication. They don't have weekly one-on-ones that are scheduled with undivided attention where monitors are turned off. That's effective communication. Too many clubs that don't have a periodic town hall with all the employees in attendance walking through these traits and values that kind of define their why. That's effective communication. So the clubs that do the onboarding, the clubs that do real-time critical feedback as it occurs, the clubs that do daily lineups, one-on-ones, and town halls, generally 95% of those employees have a really good idea what's expected, and they also get recognized for their success and coached to get better. And it's that kind of approach to this work, the same way we would with a student on a lesson tee, that ultimately drives the best cultures.
Mr. O'Brien, those are all the questions that we have this morning on the Catalyst. On behalf of the Education Committee for the SCPGA, thank you very much for coming on the webcast and educating us today. It was eye-opening and very fulfilling. Thank you very much for taking the time to do this. We realize how busy you must be, and we're very, very grateful for your time.
Well, it's a super pleasure. Thank you, John. I'd be available to talk to anybody one-off if they have questions following this meeting as well.
Very good. Indeed. The YouTube recording of this presentation will be uploaded to the SCPGA website, and we'll send an email out, which will also have Bill's contact information on there. If you didn't ask a question and you have a question for him after the fact. Thank you very much for supporting the Catalyst webinar series. We'll see you all next week. Thanks, Bill. Have a great day.
Thanks, John. Thanks all.